You have been emailed the minutes for January 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th. I trust you've had an opportunity to review those minutes, to look at them, and see if you see any adjustments, changes, corrections. If you do, we will do that. If not, we'll look for a motion for approval. Again, January 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th. We've got a motion by Senator Ware to accept the minutes as presented. Is there a second? All right, thank you. Senator Kirshen seconds the motion. Questions on the motion? All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. And I would suggest to you, committee, that you watch, because we will be sending you additional minutes for your review via email. And then if you have concerns, you can email back or let the chair know. But then we will be approving additional minutes in the not too distant future. Today on our agenda, we've got an informational briefing. This is a topic that the chair is not real familiar with, but it's been discussed in the Capitol, particularly in the other chamber. I was asked about this topic, and I said, well, let's have an informational briefing to provide the chair with information and the committee. So we will have a brief informational briefing. And it looks like Mr. Sean Miller from Capital Strategies will be providing the briefing. Mr. Miller, welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. I appreciate it. I know there is nothing that you would rather do at 8:30 on a Monday morning than listen to me. So at a minimum, I do hope at least that we have some slides that you can look at, both to protect my bald spot and so that you guys don't have to stare at me the entire time. But mostly because I'm starting off with a wonderful picture from the 39th Senate District in Rolla, Kansas, down in John Dahl's, Senator Dahl's neck of the woods. It is a little bit older. This picture was from May of 1935. So as we talk about, if I can harken back, I was more of a science guy, but if I can harken back to high school English or literature a little bit, we used to do the who, what, when, where, why. I'm not going to hit all 5 of those today because I have limited time, but I will try to talk a little bit about what, why, and how. Okay, so Kansas conservation. This is a photo in southwest Kansas in May of 1935. This actually was not the bad day, right? The bad day was April 14th. That was the Black Sunday where we lost 300 million tons of topsoil that made it all the way to Washington, D.C. before it fell back to the ground, some of it, okay? But as we talk about conservation, it was the dirty 30s and the Dust Bowl that really got us started on this. We developed the State Conservation Commission here in Kansas. A number of our federal programs began, and a lot of it was because of farming practices that did not hold up through extreme drought or extreme temperatures. So as we talk about conservation today a little bit, we really kind of want to talk about what conservation is. And the word conservation or the word sustainability to each one of us in this room may mean a slightly different thing. So as I was trying to figure out what it is and how to put it on, I decided we should look at a few statutes. My legal background came a little bit, so if we can look at the next slide. Here are a couple of explanatory statements or statutes. The first is from USDA, but the one I really want to hone in on is the next one. That is KSA 2-1915, okay? That is our state conservation district statute. It talks about, in the Department of Agriculture, the Division of Conservation, what are allowable conservation practices. And I promise I won't read a lot of stuff to you today, but I will hit this one just to kind of hit a few highlights. As we talk about conservation practices within the state of Kansas, we're talking about terraces, dams, dikes, ponds, ditches, critical area plantings, grassed waterways, irrigation technology, range seeding, soil, grassland health, detention, and control of enduring water conservation and invasive species, right? I didn't hit that exactly word for word, but I ran through a few of those. So in short, we're talking about practices that are designed to preserve our soil and soil health, keep it in place on the ground. Anybody who's ever been on the downwind side of a freshly plowed wheat field when we don't get enough rain to germinate the wheat knows what kind of soil can get up and off that ground and blowing over into the neighbor's place. But also as we look to our dwindling water supply in western Kansas, how do we continue the use of that agricultural land, irrigated and dry land, so that we can maintain all of the valuable attributes that we have in Kansas. And these are a number of the things that are in existing current state law that are allowable, right? So these provide opportunities for ag producers, whether that be a farmer, rancher, or landowner here in the state of Kansas, to protect their farm, to be more efficient, and to maintain and increase productivity on a voluntary basis. If we could flip to the next one real quick, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of things that we too often see but don't want to see, right? So this is a soil erosion problem in Pottawatomie County. Sorry, I tried to link things up with people here in the committee, but I didn't have. I could tell Senator Francisco that this is from Douglas County. It easily could be. But this is in Pottawatomie County. So as you look at this particular, the water flows from the top left down the middle to the bottom right. And when we get high flows, it is scouring out that far bank. And each time you see something like this, you may be losing 6 inches or you may be losing 6 feet of your existing land. So if you own an acre or 100 acres or 1,000 acres, when you watch your land that you paid for by the acre end up in the stream and then downstream to somebody else's, you are losing monetary value. Not just productivity, right? This was a hayfield up to the right where we were grazing cattle. So there is less land for the cattle to graze on, but also we are losing literal value as we try to sell this to someone else, and we have lost productive acreage here. This is, and we'll show you some before and after pictures of a few of these, but this is a place that a farmer might come to us and say, oh my gosh, we had such a heavy rain and look what happened. How do I fix this, right? Landowners often don't have the technical expertise or maybe the equipment. Back in the old days, we would see people pile up a bunch of giant tires in this place to try to stop it, and there is in fact a tire in the bottom. I think it actually blew up from somewhere downstream or upstream, but we would try to do something to stabilize these banks, and oftentimes we didn't do the best. We just did the best with what we had, okay? So it is important to know that these things exist. They're not positive, but nothing in our statutes requires, there's no involuntary push onto landowners, right? This is all a voluntary, I've got an issue, can you help me? It is not me driving by saying, hey, we're gonna do something on that guy or gal's land even though they don't want to. So you're gonna hear me say voluntary, I hope about 10 times today. If we can go to the next photo, we'll go a little bit further out to south central Kansas. This is in Stafford County. This is Rattlesnake Creek. We hear a lot about Rattlesnake Creek in the newspaper and in this committee. But what we see a lot when we get to central Kansas and then all the way out west, less erosion issues, right? We have less rainfall, we have less surface water, but what we see is a lot of invasive species that cause us a lot of problems. So as you look at all these shrubs and brush along the line here, if you'd go back and looked at photo of this from 100 years ago, or maybe even 50 years ago, none of that would be there. That's what we call salt cedar or Russian olive. There's a couple of different things in there. It's very often that I get to say the word phreatophytes. It is something that sends roots into the water structure and it pulls the water right out of the stream from the bottom out. So all of these invasive species, not only do they limit our native grazing capability, right? Cattle aren't eating salt cedar, but it also yanks water right out of Rattlesnake Creek, which can cause us a whole lot of problems. So as we've looked at these two things, obviously we've seen two individual private landowner situations here, but I would like to talk a little bit about who benefits from conservation as we're talking about it today. And quite frankly, the answer is all of us. I have shown you two pictures of two private lands. So you're going to say, how do we all benefit from it if these are private lands? But if you think about that first photo with all of the erosion, all of that soil, sand, dirt is going somewhere. And for those of us in the eastern half of the state, where it is going is downstream and into our water supplies. So Senator Francisco Lawrence represents their municipal water supply, relies heavily on Clinton Lake. Clinton Lake is in the Wakarusa River watershed. Every time, just south of my place, we get a big event and we have soil erosion like this, it deposits sediment in Clinton Reservoir, which limits the ability of that reservoir to hold water for water supply, right? We also hear a lot, particularly in the summers, about harmful algal blooms, blue-green algae. Anything that we can do to keep this soil, these nutrients, the fertilizers on the soil and out of the water theoretically limits those harmful algal blooms. So from a water supply, again, from a recreation standpoint, we hear all the time, don't let your dogs swim in that. They're going to get sick during the summer. We are all benefiting from this work. And not only that, but when you think in a rural community, in rural counties, the property tax value in agricultural communities is heavily dependent on the productivity of agricultural lands. So the more productive and the more in play we can keep those agricultural lands, the better job we can do of providing downward pressure on property taxes for everybody within that county. So it helps us, it helps our water supply, it helps our tax base. It also helps our native populations of wildlife, fish, and a lot of that, whether you think about it or not, maybe living in more urban parts of the state, does a tremendous amount for the rural tourism aspect of those of us here in Kansas. So we talked a little bit about what, now we get to why. If we can go to the next slide. As we talk to landowners, ag folks, if we go to the Department of Ag summit every year, or if it's a national convention, we hear three things real quick, right? What's the weather in your area? How much rain have you had? What's the crops looking like? Number two, sports. This is ag, so it's usually more about K-State football than it is KU basketball, but there's a few folks out there. And then number three, what are you doing that I'm not doing that's working good for you? We don't just hear that in Kansas, right? We hear that across the state line. We hear that at national conferences. And this shows a great example right here. The states that are in green here have some type of permanent state level funding for conservation. So we're a bit of an island there, us in Oklahoma. You'll see a photo here in a minute where I give Oklahoma an asterisk. But most of our grain belt states have provided state level funding for conservation. So what brought folks to Kansas in the first place, right? Settlers came to Kansas, 1840s, 1850s, abundant grass, fertile soil, plenty of water. We may be in 2024, but those things still ring true 170 years later, and we need to work to try to make sure that that is true in another 100 years. I don't really like to point out much about Missouri, but I will twice today. Missouri is kind of the gold standard for this. They have a dedicated state sales tax that I'll talk about a little bit later, dedicated to conservation. So this is one of those places I would love to steal a great idea from Missouri. But why would you ask that we need this? We have a state level division of conservation. They do a fantastic job with the resources they have. But last year in EQIP alone, we had $86 million in applications put out by Kansas farmers and ranchers that went unfunded. So we have to hierarchy rank these things, and we simply can't fund them all. As we talk about conservation practices, we talk about EQIP, CRP, CSP. There's a number of those. You think of grassland, riparian buffers, but also terracing and tile work within your ag fields. And it's not just federal programs. There's also a number of corporations. ADM jumps to mind, Archer Daniels Midland, that provides to help sort of stabilize their supply chain, public-private partnerships with landowners on the ground as well. So to the next slide, if we could, provides a little bit of a drill down for us, and this is our neighboring states. So Oklahoma was white in the last one. They're green in this one. They have some state tribal compacts, so they're a little bit different than the rest of the states. But as we look at our surrounding states, they all do a tremendous job. Missouri uses state sales tax. Colorado uses lottery funds. One of the things I'd be remiss as you look at our neighboring states here, particularly if you look at rural, is sort of rural health of our communities, right? There was a time 20 years ago when I first moved to Kansas and we went out to western Kansas to do an opening weekend pheasant hunt. So the pheasant hunt was secondary. The guys that I went with were first trying to do the football booster fundraiser breakfast. Then they hit a church lunch chili feed, and then they did an Elks Club fundraiser in the evening that weekend. So that was what basically the fundraising for the entire rural community was wrapped around, was opening weekend of pheasant season. We have lost a lot of that as we've lost a lot of habitat, right? And so that habitat goes hand in hand with ag production, but also with some of this rural community. And also, as you look at this map, you think about the investment that we've made in rural broadband, the return back home. We have seen a real quality of life want from folks in the urban who would like to move back to rural communities, usually within striking distance of an urban area, but they're looking for sort of that slower pace of life, quality of a small community, fresh air, outdoor recreation, those sorts of things. So next slide if I can, because I am rapidly running out of time. So where are we and why are we here? Over about the last, 20 years probably, we've been talking about these, but over the last 5 or 6, you have seen this slide maybe grow more and more. In fact, it's probably grown since I printed it last week. We have about 35 to 40 different organizations right now, from agricultural groups to commercial groups, wildlife, various nonprofits, who have tried to coalesce around this issue. If Colorado can do this, if Texas can do this, as Missouri can do this, why can't we? And so we brought this whole group together to try to come up with a plan, right? So you can see there's some really, really varied interests in this particular case. So how do we encourage conservation? I said earlier, the Division of Conservation is doing a great job. Our local county conservation district's doing a great job, but with limited resources. This group got together to try to talk, steal some best practices from other states. I'm always willing to look outside the box, but if somebody else is doing it well and it works, why don't we borrow what they do? And so that's exactly what we did. We looked at Missouri. They have a dedicated sales tax. We looked at Texas. They have a sales tax on sporting goods. And we looked at Colorado. They have lottery funds. So as you would look at some of the plans that we put together, our key facts were, number one, if we're going to fund conservation, we don't want it to be a new tax. We want to use existing revenue streams. So nothing from this should raise anybody's taxes, even $1, right? So what you would see within the state of Texas and other places, they took the existing NAICS codes for sporting goods, bicycles, hunting, fishing, backpacking gear, and said, let's carve off a little piece of that existing tax that goes to the state general fund for those things, and let's put it back into habitat that helps those things, provides more recreation, provides more wildlife habitat, provides better farming practices that keep more food for the wildlife out there if you're on the wildlife side, but on the agricultural side, things that keep you productive on the farm and in business. The Texas sporting goods sales tax generates about $330 million a year. Colorado lottery funds, about $120 million a year, just for a little bit of perspective. Next slide, please. What I'm going to do quickly now is run you through the before and after of a couple of those, right? This is what conservation practice would look like, some grade stabilization and some erosion stabilization in Pottawatomie County. We've put some riprap in there. You could see weirs. You could see any number of things depending on the project. But now as that sediment comes down, the rocks should help more sediment from picking up, and it should help attract some of that that's coming downstream, and it should fill into those weirs. The next slide, please, is the Rattlesnake Creek, which is in Stafford County, and you see we have removed all of that salt cedar, all of that Russian olive, and that does a lot. Number one, it helps to restore wildlife habitat. It restores more of the grazing pressure to this. We have more ability to run cattle on this, and it protects that water supply for both this particular producer and for downstream users. It also establishes back the native grassland, which filters out a lot of the sedimentation, a lot of the nutrients that we would see end up downstream. Last slide, and I promise it's last slide. So as we talked about those funding mechanisms, we took a look at all the other states and what they did, and Kansans for Conservation, that organization I showed earlier, took a poll. Of the things that the other states do, Kansans, which would you be supportive of? So number one, right off the top, is would you take part of the existing sales tax that's already coming into the state general fund for sporting goods and dedicate that to conservation and recreation? 82% said yes. The second one, lottery revenues, 77% said yes. The third one, sports gaming, 63% said yes. Worth noting, this is probably a little lower because at the time we did this poll, sports gaming was not legal in Kansas. So we also asked, okay, is this, you don't support this, but is it because maybe you don't support sports gaming? Because we were asking them about a funding stream that was not legal and not allowed at that time. So I know that is a really quick overview. We're going to hear some more discussion, we hope, in the House either later this year or next year. Without getting too deep into the bill, if any of you choose to look at it or the fiscal notes, it was House Bill 2541. We had a hearing over in House Ag this year. And I know that a number of people had probably visited with senators when we were here for Conservation Day. So that is the reason we requested the chair, and he so graciously gave us the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what we are trying to do. And that is get more money into the system for voluntary landowner and community participation in these conservation programs. So I appreciate it. I ran about a minute too long, I think, but I appreciate your discretion there. And if there's any questions, I am more than happy to answer those at the appropriate time.
Mr. Miller, appreciate you working diligently to stay within the time frame you and I had just talked about. Did a great job.
Thank you, sir.
Close enough. Committee questions of Mr. Miller. Well, I've got a couple questions, I guess. I thought the committee would. You said that 97% of Kansas lands are privately owned. And you used the word early on, involuntary, looking back at some of my notes. So if a landowner has a situation such as the pictures, they can voluntarily ask for assistance. What future issues may they deal with? In other words, is this a one-time deal? You come in, you work on the conservation, ending or reducing erosion and so forth, and then you're gone, they never see or hear from you again? Or are they going to be checked on in the future?
Sure. And there are dozens of existing programs, so whatever answer I give you today is going to be a bit of a generalization. These programs, we'll just look at the Pottawatomie County erosion position that we have there, are designed to be decades-long life programs, right? So they put these practices on. I was running a little late. I didn't get to make a couple of my jokes. You saw that erosion. Boys being boys, even when they're in their 50s and 60s. That's the kind of thing with a tractor that I could easily dump that in the creek and drown myself or my tractor. And so what we're really looking for is technical expertise and equipment in those particular cases. What exactly is the engineering of this erosion that will in fact solve the problem and not just make it look good for a minute or two, right? But once that practice is on the ground and in place for that particular erosion control, that's it. I mean, that's the end of the project. It should be 20, 30, 40, 50-year project, but there is no coming back to check on, to look at. So the practices can vary quite a lot. There are certain practices, again, that you enter into voluntarily. We'll talk about CRP, that has a 10-plus year lifespan where you have to follow certain restrictions through the course of that lifespan. You can't pick a 10-year CRP contract, get paid for it, and then rip it out the next year. You have a certain amount of time. But again, you enter into that contract at the beginning on a voluntary basis. And then just like any contract, there's abilities to do other things, but penalties or clawbacks or those kinds of things.
So you used the word involuntary. Are there some involuntary conservation practices?
So if I use the word involuntary, I hope I said nothing in our program is involuntary. These are all voluntary incentive-based programs. So there's not a program that I'm aware of in the state of Kansas where the state of Kansas would force a program down upon a landowner. The one place that you might trickle into that area a little bit, it's actually already on the books. It has nothing to do with ours, is a noxious weed law. But that is sort of a whole different rabbit hole that we could go down another day if you wanted to.
So conservation, does that work with what has been talked about for the last several years from the federal government, which we commonly call WOTUS, Waters of the U.S.? How do the two of those mesh together, or do they not?
They do not. I would suggest that some of the WOTUS, some of the conservation practices certainly do a lot of benefit to the local water supply, but WOTUS, as we sort of commonly talk about it, is sort of the connection of intermittent or ephemeral streams into fully navigable streams. None of these particular practices would have anything to do with that. Our work might be on a stream, but it would have no direct connection to WOTUS or not WOTUS.
And my final question, then we'll get to some of the committee members. If a landowner has property and there's a neighboring or adjacent land, the creek runs through both. The erosion is definitely on the border, on the line, the property line. One property owner wants conservation to come in to assist with their erosion, but the other does not. You just start at the property line and go forward, or stop, if you will, at the property line?
That's an excellent question and probably better answered by the Division of Conservation. But again, nothing in our particular programs would allow one landowner's project to impede over and, in an involuntary nature, move on to the neighbor's landowner. So I'm going to guess if your property line is divided by the creek, then your bank, right, is something that you could deal with, but you could not deal with your neighbor's bank. That would all be a survey issue, quite frankly.
I understand that if the creek is a property line, but if a creek is entirely on one property and then it goes across the property line entirely, so you would just start or stop at the property line.
Correct.
According to, okay, Senator
Correct.
Dahl.
Yeah, actually, if we showed a broader overhead view of that Rattlesnake Creek piece earlier, you can watch it roll all the way down until it hits a certain highway. So, and then in the after effects, you can see the salt cedar and the Russian olive on the left side of the highway extending all the way down the creek, and on the right side of the highway, it's just beautiful grass the way it would have looked 100 years ago. So we got to that property line, which in this case also happened to be demarcated by a highway, two totally different aspects. So.
Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Where's House Bill 2541? I looked it up, and where's it at right now?
It's in the House Agriculture Committee.
Is it going to get a hearing?
It got a hearing back on January 22nd. And so obviously we're in turnaround week. It is not an exempt bill. If it is not worked by tomorrow, I don't anticipate it will be, just FYI. Then it's something that we were going to continue to work on through the remainder of the session and through the summer and get ready to be back here in 2025.
Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Miller, for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, sir.
As I sat and listened to this, I question what responsibilities a property owner has. You know, we're sitting here, if we got grandma living in town helping pay for this, you would think the property owner would be the one that would care the most about what's going on with this, and you might comment on that a little bit, and then I got a couple follow-ups.
I'm happy to. As we talk about sort of public-private partnerships, or in some cases public-public partnerships, usually the landowner has a stake in these projects as well, right? Maybe what he doesn't have is the technical expertise. Right now, with the limited funding that we have, Division of Conservation, the conservation districts, they sort of rank everything and say, okay, is this really a you problem or is this an us problem? And so as we look at sedimentation levels in a highly erodible area above a really critical municipal water supply, that is perhaps the type of program that would float a little bit higher on the priority list as they're looking to fund. So what is the downstream benefit of this? Is the downstream benefit of this only to Sean? If so, Sean is going to bear a lot of the responsibility of this. Is the downstream benefit of this the entirety of Johnson County and the water supply for the greater Kansas City area? If so, then maybe the local landowner piece of that is a little bit smaller. But whether it's the ADM project or some of the USDA provisions, for most of them there is a local landowner input portion. You got a cost match share. Then there's a cost match of the program or possibly even two programs within that. So there's certainly benefit there. And I would tell you that in the existing programs, those particular projects that only benefit one landowner typically have a much higher landowner stake in that.
The floor is yours.
The other question I have, been doing a little bit of reading on the water development protection. It's a federal deal they do every 2 years.
Okay.
And I was looking through that, and there was quite a few projects where they come out and analyze what's going into these core lakes. So I guess my question is, has Kansas done anything of trying to get some federal funds to help with this? Because we're asking the state, I think the federal government's dishing some money out in some other states that I would question we need to get in line for that. So just comment on that.
Senator, I don't know that I can answer your question on that particular project. I will tell you, in case I wasn't clear, there is a lot of federal or outside private investment in these particular projects. What we are looking for is the state portion to match those federal dollars, right? So in particular on the water development that you just talked about, I am unfamiliar with that. I'm happy to research that, see if we can find some answers in that. But as we talk about a number of the other practices that we have in here, whether it's grassland conservation or CRP, there is a very large piece of federal pie to that, but we have to have state and local match before we can access those dollars. The same is true for our private investment that I mentioned with ADM earlier. They have money that they are willing to put better nutrient retention and better sort of supply chain for them, quite frankly, to keep their farmers productive. But again, that takes local and individual stakeholder match to draw down those corporate dollars in that particular case.
And one final one. There's a program called the Banker Soil Conservation Award that's been given for 50 years. And when I drive around and can compare in the last 50 years, I think we've made some progress in some of those with your terraces and things like that. So I guess I'm questioning, exactly, does that program work? It's just the idea of how much money we throw at something like this. And that's one part. The other part is when you look at this, water takes its own course. If we look at a map and look at this creek, it might go like this, and we'd be working on every bank in there. Is that something that nature kind of plays into this too? And just a thought.
Sure. Quickly, the KBA Conservation Award is really a recognition of work that landowners have done. Much of the work landowners have done is through some of these existing programs, but we do have a limited pod, and that's changed through the years, right? In the 30s, we were just like, hey, let's put up as many tree rows as we can, so when the dirt blows, at least it has something to hit and stop. And those practices have changed over the last 70, 80 years, certainly. And I think they will continue to evolve. But in terms of nature taking its course, there is always going to be erosion. What we are looking to try to deal with is sort of the major catastrophic events, right? The things that are, in fact, preventable. Water, by its sort of very definition, as it runs down a creek or a river course, is going to hold a certain amount of sediment. And if it doesn't, it's going to find it somewhere else. That's why you hear about scouring issues within the Kansas River and things like that. So there is some natural native amount of sediment that's going to be there, but we're looking for those sort of major catastrophic events that really fill up our federal reservoirs in a hurry, because we've talked about dredging a lot. Senator, I know you're on Ways and Means Committee, and dredging is exceedingly expensive. And so it's one of those situations where $1 on the front end might save us $100 on the back end. So we're really looking for return on investment in these particular projects.
Senator Fagg, always remember, creeks became crooked by taking the path of least resistance. Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sean, thank you for being here. I'd be happy to give you some pictures of the Delaware River in Jefferson County, and that is one where I have, gone out with some landowners to see how many feet of their previous cropland is now in the river. So I do know that that makes a difference for the Perry Reservoir as well as the Clinton Reservoir. So I understand what's happening there. I'm interested in Rattlesnake Creek, especially because we are recommending, or the money has already been appropriated. Will that money be matched by any of the federal dollars to help address that concern?
So I listened, thank you, Senator. I listened to the division, or the Department of Agriculture budget just enough the other week to know enough to be dangerous. So there's a number of engineering programs and study programs that are going into that to try to deal with, right, as we talk about Rattlesnake Creek, I'm going to dance around it, it's the Quivira National Wildlife Refuge issue, and that is one of the most senior water rights in that area. Some of that money is going to this type of phreatophyte removal, right? The more water we can keep in the creek, the more water we can deliver to the refuge, the less that we need to reduce water in other places. So the answer to that is in part, yes, some of that will be matched and be able to roll through these programs. I believe, and I don't want to step on KDA's toes here, but some of that is also going perhaps to some engineering and some studies on some other possible issues that will help resolve that problem. So I don't know that everything in there is going to be matched through these programs, but some of that, particularly on sort of the stream bank type issues like this, should be eligible for a number of those programs.
Well, I appreciate that because I've seen a lot of the salt cedar and Russian olive in places that it shouldn't be. And these photographs really do show that we can make a difference.
If you go play golf in Syracuse in Senator Dahl's district, then they're in all the wrong places because that's where my golf balls end up, is in those salt cedars.
Any additional questions? I told Mr. Miller he was limited on time, but I would not limit questions. But I'm not going to solicit questions either. Mr. Miller, appreciate your presentation, appreciate you answering questions for us this morning. And this topic is a topic probably will not go away anytime soon, committee. That's all that I have for today, committee. Tomorrow we will look at working or some final action potentially. And so we shall see you tomorrow morning. We are adjourned.